Hello and welcome to another instalment of the Linnenhall Library's Northern Ireland Political Collection lecture series. I'm Dr. AIMÉE Walsh, an early career research fellow with the Women's History Network. Firstly, I would like to say thank you to Jason Burke for inviting me to give this public lecture for the Linnenhall Library. A lot of the sources which I draw upon in this lecture came primarily from the Northern Ireland Political Collection at Linnenhall. And other invaluable materials came from Dr. Margaret Ward and my friend and former colleague Danielle Roberts of the University of Ulster kindly passed on the materials. So thank you to both Margaret and Danielle. Before I get started, I would like to note the work which Trina White Hamilton is currently conducting to digitise these periodicals for the Linnenhall Library as part of the Extraordinary Women project. I'm very excited to see the scholarship develop from such a vital resource. And finally, I'll have my contact details at the end of this presentation if anyone has any questions or comments. So today I'm going to talk about feminist periodicals between the period 1975 and 1980 and the relationship with protest and republicanism. So before I begin into the specifics, I want to map out a bit of background of the era. So in 1972, we saw the launch of Spare Rib, which was a British feminist journal. 1973, the landmark case Roe versus Wade for abortion rights in the United States. 1975 saw the first Take Back the Night march, again in the US, and that was against gendered violence. And later in 1977, we had similar Reclaim the Night marches in Newcastle, which have spread across the UK. Similarly, in 1975, we had the United Nations Year of Women and an IRA ceasefire. So this is to say that the years prior to the time period that I'm going to focus on for this lecture saw a rise in feminist resistance, specifically as a result of second wave feminism. It is in this way that there was a global background of feminist protests as a tool of resistance. Similarly, the period 1975 to 1980, there was a surge of feminist activity occurring in Northern Ireland. During this time, feminist groups were created and split again in a changing frontier of women's activism. A broader women's group, the Northern Ireland Women's Rights Movement, was also in operation at this time. However, as is explored in my work elsewhere, primarily my doctoral thesis, they did not engage with Republican feminism, specifically due to the debates which arose out of the Armagh Gaol political prison protests. This period is of importance as heated debate occurred within the feminist movement due to the influence of the Republican prison protests, which I could give a whole other separate lecture on, exploring the intersections of feminism and republicanism. But it was due to this environment that the Socialist women's group emerged, and the launch of this group in 1975 marks the genesis of feminist periodicals in the North during the Troubles. In the same year as the United Nations International Women's Year, held in 1975, the official Sinn Féin imprint, Repsol, published the Republican movement's views on women in its pamphlet, The Rights of Women in Ireland. The contents note that, quote, the position of women in Irish society is changing, end quote, and that this very change would be, quote, slow and painful. This recognition that women were, quote, still very definitely second-class citizens, end quote, is contradicted as the pamphlet argued instead for the subjugation of women's issues in favour of the party's pursuit of the dismantlement of the capitalist and, by extension, imperialist system. The pamphlet contended that it is not patriarchal structures that keep women contained as very definitely second-class citizens, but rather the system which controls all in society. They say, quote, it is obvious that to liberate themselves, women must help to liberate their own countries. Their own development in a cultural and economic sense is inseparable from the achievement of deep-rooted social, political and economic transformations of concern to the people as a whole. It is quite obvious that without achieving the basic conditions of social justice and equality for all members of society, we cannot discuss women's equality. It's worth noting here too that this imprint of the official Republican movement, which differs from the provisionals. Again, the splits and fractures within Republicanism is an area which is covered by scholars such as Richard English, and most recently Marissa McGlinchey in her fantastic research on dissident Republicanism. However, one thing holds true for Republicanism, whether it's official or provisional, in the 1970s and 80s at least, that women's equality was not high on the agenda. To begin, I must go against chronological instincts and say where the Republican feminist movement arrives at the end of this period. In 1980, Nell McCafferty wrote for the Irish Times an article titled "There's Blood on the Walls of Armagh Gaol," in which she argued for the mistreatment of women in Armagh as a feminist issue, regardless of their political beliefs. This caused debate north and south of the border, which centred on the issue of Armagh Republican political prisoners and the conditions in which they were incarcerated. However, the years prior to this, feminist periodicals created the bedrock for this discussion of these issues. The work of the three feminist groups I discussed today, the Socialist Women's Group, Belfast Women's Collective, and Women Against Imperialism, each engaged with Republican political prisoners who were interned, denied menstrual products, and subjected to violence. It is in this way that these groups created a Republican feminist niche movement. So in my approach to this niche movement, I draw upon Claire Hackett's article, The Republican Feminist Agenda, which theorized the central tenet which ties together these two movements, that of self-determination. She says, quote, "The concept self-determination is perhaps better known for its nationalist than its feminist connotations. Yet it must be clear that it has meaning for feminist discourse. Self-determination as the right and ability to make real choices about our lives, our fertility, our sexuality, childcare, the means to be independent, and all the areas in which we are currently denied autonomy and dignity in our various identities as women. This central concern of autonomy, whether that's economic, bodily, political, is evident in the newspapers which each of these feminist groups, which I will go on to talk about, produced. Elsewhere, Eilish Rooney wrote of three distinct areas within the feminist movement in the North: the rights feminists who campaigned on the basis that women's rights took precedence over the national question, the community activist feminists who worked on campaigns to do with childcare and women's centres, and the Republican feminists, she argued, prioritised the national question. Rooney questions, whose personal is more political, yours or mine? She calls for an intersectionality which includes the oppressions of those from differing political backgrounds. It is in this way that the Republican feminists, which I focus on in this talk, encapsulate aspects of each of the three strands of Northern feminism. The Republican feminist group, Women Against Imperialism, who will be discussed later, wrote of the resistance they received in response to these Republican feminist objectives. Quote, the women's movement and the anti-imperial movement have eyed each other with suspicion, end quote. However, this talk will show that a niche movement of Republican feminism was formed despite these frictions. For added context, Theresa O'Keeffe has theorised for a Republican feminist consciousness which developed when women joined the ranks of the previously all-male IRA in September 1970. And in turn, Niall Gilmartin's study of the invisibility of Republican women within the movement, with its retrospective view from post-conflict and post-Good Friday Agreement provisional IRA and provisional Sinn Féin members, also informs my approach to the periodicals greatly. So taking his cue from the work of O'Keeffe, Gilmartin situates Republican women as agents of their own history by moving, quote, beyond exploring the ways in which male-led movements position women and instead focus on the ways in which nationalist women themselves organise their political struggles, end quote. So I draw upon the works of O'Keeffe and Gilmartin as a guide for approaching the text, which I will explore in the following slides. To begin an entry into feminist print culture, it's important to note the presentation of women in the posters of the IRA, which show militancy, public street protests, and bin lid banging to warn of army incursion into nationalist areas. The visuals of this poster in particular is striking as it situates women as agents of historical change through protest and resistance. Periodicals worked in a similar way, using visuality as key to reproduce their message. The newspapers become a record of their own resistance against patriarchy and imperialism, and as such, print culture is a site for rebellion. So on to the feminist periodicals. A group of women splintered from the Northern Ireland women's rights movement to start the Socialist Women's Group in 1975. And although, quote, it was intended that the two groups would cooperate with each other, they became more rather than less distant as time passed, end quote. The genesis of the Socialist Women's Group in turn led to Belfast Women's Collective and in turn again to Women Against Imperialism. The groups, although having shared lineage, were distinct and separate in their focus. The Socialist Women's Group centralised around issues of socialism, the Belfast Women's Collective around issues affecting working class women, and Women Against Imperialism was a single issue group which focused on the issue of state violence and specifically the Armagh women political prisoners. The Socialist Women's Group was established in October 1975 in response to a perceived lack of engagement within the wider feminist movement, namely the Northern Ireland women's rights movement. The Socialist Women's Group's main area of contention was that geographical areas typically under the greatest threat from British imperialism, for example, nationalist areas, were being ignored. In response, the Socialist Women's Group argued for women's place within the political situation in the north of Ireland. They say, since the immediate and direct cause of women's oppression in Northern Ireland is British imperialism, any attempt to separate the two issues would be fatuous in the extreme and would alienate the most militant women. In other words, to separate the imperialist impression and the oppression of women is to misunderstand the cause and effect of both. In setting up this new group, the women aimed to fuse socialism, feminism, and anti-imperialism. The Socialist Women's Group also claimed that the Republican movement was suspicious of feminism and not vice versa. Quote, the position of women in Irish society cannot be radically changed unless imperialism is defeated, but neither will progressive change automatically follow the defeat of imperialism in the absence of a women's movement prepared to fight for those changes. We reject the suggestion by some Republicans that the women's question is a diversion from the anti-imperialist struggle, as is continually implied by Sinn Féin, brackets Republican News. The Socialist Women's Group here argue that the provisional Republican movement denied the intersection between gender and the national question. This compounds the official Sinn Féin's The Rights of Women in Ireland, which laid out a manifesto of sorts for the national struggle, which laid out a manifesto which the national question should subsume any idea of Republican feminism. In this way, the cause of Republican feminism is rejected by the broader Republican movement, both provisional and official. The Socialist Women's Group wrote that, quote, too often their own demands have been ignored by their male comrades and suppressed by women themselves out of a desire to preserve a supposed unity of forces, end quote. So the Socialist Women's Group write that they were created in response to an abstraction of the women's question outside of the context of imperial oppression. The group launched their inaugural edition of Women's Action newspaper by situating themselves within the tradition of rebellion and resistance within Irish history. In the context of the 1916 Easter Rising, the opening article announces, "Throughout the course of Irish history, women have organised and fought for national liberation. When their men were in jail, it was the women, often despite great hardship to themselves and their children, who continued the struggle." This echoes the situation in 1976 Northern Ireland, from the mass internment of men and women to the British Army killing civilians protesting for civil rights in Derry. The correlation can be understood as a call for nationalist people, particularly women, to persist in the resistance of the British colonialist state. They continue in their article by writing, "Nothing has ever been given to an oppressed group without a fight. And when their men were free, they then went back to their kitchens and their children, allowing the men to make all the decisions. They believed the myth that their own demands must wait, and so their needs were never discussed." So this identifies a pattern of historical colonial violence against women, which centred around domesticity and the home. And as a side note here, I would like to mention Ellie Davies' upcoming talk in this series on the themes of resistance and the home during this time period, which is sure to be a great companion piece to this talk. So the Socialist Women's Group implore women to not defer to gender stereotypes which were in place prior to times of violent political turbulence and agitation. Instead, they call for these women to actively disrupt gendered structures. The myth that their own demands must come secondary to the national question is in direct response to the Republican movement's patriarchal hierarchy. This violence which the women faced was no doubt very real. The Socialist Women's Group write in a letter that a feminist was physically beaten off a platform by people from the Republican movement during a May Day march in 1975. And further violence against this group is exemplified in the RUC's response to the Socialist Women's Group, which Margaret Ward and Mary Therese McGivern write, quote, "At a trade union May Day march in 1978, the right of women's groups to march was denied, and a group had their banner Women's Action removed by the RUC because they were regarded as a peripheral Republican group. Who else could be calling for women's action? Feminists in the North are in a problematic situation because they are under attack from all sides," end quote. It is here that the obstacles faced by women are multiple. Or put another way, the Socialist Women's Group write in their inaugural front page article that, quote, "We cannot simply isolate one aspect of the struggle, they are all interlinked." This connection of struggles, from the material to the bodily, is linked to the oppression of women in Armagh Gaol, as the prison campaign was in direct pursuit of autonomy, liberation, and independence. The Republican feminists, through their demands, rejected complacency with the status quo, and in entering into rebellion, not only against the British state, but also misogyny perpetrated by the Republican leadership, they cemented their legacy as revolutionaries. The group called on their readership to support their campaign for the Republican prisoners to gain political status. They featured reportage on the creation of and interviews with members of the Relatives Action Committees, which worked in geographical areas to lobby for political status for their relatives. The Republican women of the Relatives Action Committee were able to find a medium for their voices to be heard in the Women's Action publication, which was not readily available from traditional Republican media outlets such as / Republican News. This active dissent in opposition to the masculinized Republican media towards a solidarity with feminists is a key moment within Republican feminist history. It marks a moment for public criticism of the movement and the space for women within it. In one article, the RAC write, "We need a stronger leadership. We also need more support from the people who now don't seem to be interested. Although it's an awful thing to say, it will take a boy in H block to die and then they will come out, but that is too late. It's going to be one of our sons and we don't want that. As soon as some of those boys die, they will be out in their hundreds." I think this is an extraordinary quote, as these women have a foresight of what's to come in 1980 and 1981 with the hunger strikes. It's just an extraordinary quote. In June 1977, the Socialist Women's Group disbanded and another group was created, the Belfast Women's Collective, which continued to publish women's action. The genesis of the Belfast Women's Collective is only traceable from the first number of its second volume, published in February 1978. However, in this newspaper, there's an insight into the fractures which led to the Socialist Women's Group disbanding. Quote, "The group was divided both on its composition and on its general direction. Some women feeling that by calling itself socialist, the group was in fact alienating those women who it mostly wished to work with. It was felt that a more open group was needed, which catered for all women regardless of whether they were socialists or not." The lines along which this group divided seem to be based upon a political description of feminism, i.e. socialist feminism, as a label being too extreme for popular support. Explicitly, the Belfast Women's Collective said of the Socialist Women's Group, quote, that by calling itself socialist, the group was in fact alienating the women that it most wanted to work with. This reasoning shows that language was the key determination in the breakdown of this feminist group. So the Belfast Women's Collective, there was two distinct phases. The first phase encapsulated both the Armagh women's protests and also health concerns, such as contraception and motherhood, whereas the second phase focused only on health concerns. The paper's function in these early transition issues was to focus on testimonies describing how working class nationalist women lived. The opening of issue 8, published in September 1977, entitled "Army Brutality in Turf Lodge," detailed the abuse that the residents of the area received at the hands of the British military. Quote, "On Friday, August 12th, at 2:45, the Brits came to Mrs. Bernie Hyland's house looking for her husband. On discovering that he wasn't there, they proceeded to punch her in the eye and mouth. They then dragged her out and kicked her in the stomach and then knocked her unconscious with a blow from the rifle butt at the back of her head. Mrs. Hyland was beaten and kicked in the stomach even though she was pregnant." Details taken from two more residents revealed similar levels of violence inflicted by the British Army. The house of AIMÉE was raided at 2 a.m. on August 16th, which included digging up the garden. She recalled the army breaking her water pipes to flood her kitchen, the soldiers urinating on mattresses, and being informed that she, quote, "if she went on any more protests, that they would put a bullet through her head," end quote. This testimony highlights an active threat against women rebelling against imperialist violence. The article details that the women in the area had had enough of this harassment by the British Army. Quote, "We all got together and decided to protest and keep the army out ourselves. We decided that instead of the children going out rioting, we would go out and rattle bin lids and blow the whistles and thus keep the army out." This sets the tone for a new paradigm of Republican feminism, as the newspapers adopted the function of documenting the testimonies of women who experienced state violence. The form of printing these experiences is a Republican feminist act of rebellion in itself, as it resists the silencing which these attacks sought to achieve. The Armagh political prisoners were featured often within the pages of the initial phase of Women's Action Belfast Women's Collective. The new grouping accused the Republican movement of denying the women the same attention in comparison with the men in Longkesh. They surmised that the reasoning for this was due to the relatively small number of women incarcerated, the conditions within the women's prison being, quote, slightly better, end quote, and that, quote, women were traditionally played a secondary role in the anti-imperialist struggle, end quote. However, the increased number of women interned and incarcerated required the support of Republican women. One interviewee argued that the struggle can't continue without women. Apart from the large number involved in the revolutionary side, there are also many more involved in street protests. This is where the Relatives Action Committee is so important, because it is women organised and mobilising themselves. This is bound to affect their position inside the Republican movement. The men have got to accept them and realise what women can do. At the moment, it is women who are doing all the propaganda and protests, end quote. It is through this that two factions within the Republican movement become apparent. The Republican feminist movement become apparent, sorry. That of militant Republican protest and that of popular street protest. The feminist Republican issue here crystallizes around the women incarcerated in Armagh, and by extension, the women involved in campaigning for them. The Belfast Women's Collective used their paper as a way of furthering visibility of women's involvement in protest. So in 1979, the Belfast Women's Collective splintered to form a new group called Women Against Imperialism. And after 1979, the Belfast Women's Collective does not appear to publish any more newspapers. And it's worth noting too that the timing coincides with an escalation of prison protests, specifically through the 1980 and then subsequent 1981 hunger strikes. These protests within the prison caused public uproar at the treatment of prisoners, which culminated in marches and demonstrations in Northern Ireland and globally. The Women Against Imperialist group consisted of women from Andersonstown and also members who had split from the Belfast Women's Collective to form this new group. The women who left the BWC to form WAI decided that the former was too academic and middle class. The newly formed group argued that the BWC, the Belfast Women's Collective, was not treating their involvement with the Relatives Action Committee as a paramount issue. Women Against Imperialism wrote in their statement, quote, "In our view, working with anti-imperialist women in the RAC, the Relatives Action Committee, is not just another campaign." Excuse me. Imperialism is the major dominating force in the lives of women throughout Ireland, and specifically women in West Belfast. In response to this, the Belfast Women's Collective wrote, "The collective believes that the Women Against Imperialism group, because of their emphasis on police and army brutality and the RAC campaign for political status, are presenting an oversimplified view of imperialism and how it is related to the oppression of women." Women Against Imperialism was closely aligned with the Relatives Action Committee, which was born out of the need for a community group to protest and campaign on behalf of the political prisoners, both within Longkesh and Armagh Gaol. To WAI, the Women Against Imperialism, therefore it was aligned with the specifically narrow scope of anti-imperialist feminism. Explicitly, the WAI wrote, quote, "We are unanimously in solidarity with the Republican women in Armagh and their continuous struggle to free Ireland from British imperialism, and we find the British government guilty of torture and criminal oppression against Irish people," end quote. The Women Against Imperialism group centred their operations primarily in relation to the political prisoners. They say, quote, "We see ourselves as part of the women's movement and also felt it important to openly identify with the struggle for national liberation." In the tradition of publishing a newspaper to circulate and promote Republican feminism, Women Against Imperialism published Saraban, or Free Woman, which translates from Irish as an imperative to free woman. This paper echoed the first phase of the Belfast Women's Collective, Women's Action, in its function of voicing the testimonies of Republican women, especially those incarcerated in Armagh. The opening issue ran the cover page headline, "The Forgotten Woman," or "The Forgotten Women," which is a pithy description of women throughout Irish history. The group wrote that women's visibility protesting on the streets of the north of Ireland has brought them into a position where they can no longer be forgotten about and ignored. So in their first issue of 1979, the group wrote of 2 pickets at Armagh Gaol. The first held on International Women's Day, the 8th of March in 1979, saw the women prisoners attacked and arrested by the RUC for showing their support of the political women prisoners. 11 women were arrested by the RUC following their protest at the prison. Numerous women reported that the treatment meted out by the police force was unnecessarily aggressive and pointed in its sexism, as the men arrested were released in a small amount of time compared with the women who were held in custody. The result of this saw 2 of their members, Margaretta Darcy and Liz LaBrue, imprisoned for their refusal to pay a fine for disrupting the peace. Cromwell Ralston reports that, quote, "They in turn joined the protest in prison, attempting to interest their fellow prisoners in feminism." For more on this, see Darcy's memoir of this time in prison, which is called "Tell Them Everything," in which she documents talking to the prisoners about feminism and about her involvement on the protests with them. The cover headline of issue 3 reads, quote, "We dedicate this issue to our sisters in Armagh." This is the first instance that I can find, at least, in my research, the use of the feminist term sisters in relation to the Republican women, which solidifies the link between both struggles. The unnecessarily violent response from the police force against a peaceful protest outside the prison walls is telling. The state response meted out against these Republican feminists was violently misogynistic. The treatment of the Women Against Imperialist members echoes that of the Socialist women's group's treatment on the May Day March in 1978, in that the fusion of republicanism and feminism was met by state violence on both occasions. The women both rejected and resisted this oppression and refused to be silenced. In this instance, a second picket was carried out at Armagh by the Women Against Imperialist group on April 7th, and that passed peacefully. Within the International Women's Day 1980 edition of the WAI journal, an image was captioned, quote, "Militant sisters shout support to their sisters," as the women shouted support up to the cell windows at Armagh Gaol. This support is framed through the lens of feminism rather than republicanism, and this distinction is pertinent as the pamphlet is single issue, the plight of these prisoners. This image was paired with the International Women's Day 1980 march in which it was reported that 500 people were at the picket, compared with 50 the previous year. They argued that the increase was due to the support of the Armagh 11, the 11 women who were arrested for protesting the conditions in the prison the previous year. It's also reported that feminists came over from Britain to support the Women Against Imperialism in their 1980 Women's Day picket of the jail. So there was an evident awakening of feminist thought within the prison. So this poem appears alongside images of Margaret Thatcher, with the haunting depiction of two women prisoners hanging from her earrings. It says, "We want women's rights, not right-wing women." From this image, it can be deduced that Women Against Imperialism were arguing against a biologically essentialist form of feminism, in that being a woman does not equate to inherently being feminist in outlook, as is seen in the example of Margaret Thatcher. In this, the women outline that being a feminist cannot exist in a political vacuum. Women's rights should include a socialist and anti-imperialist approach, which seeks to unsettle domination of colonised people. The women in Armagh write of a link between their struggle in the north of Ireland and women engaged in other international revolutionary struggles, such as the women of the Basque separatist group ETA and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, amongst others. They say, "We recognise that all these women are engaged in a legitimate struggle for autonomy and self-determination." So these two key traits, autonomy and self-determination, are key to Republican feminism, as I outlined earlier. Further, it situated the women within a tradition of internationalist revolutionary feminism, and the WAI believe that there can be no disentanglement between women's rights and anti-imperialist resistance. The women wrote to draw a parallel between their struggle and that of feminism. So the political prisoners write, "We have come a long way from Emily Pankhurst," and in this they're aligning themselves fully within the framework of feminism. Emily Pankhurst's dictum, "Deeds not words," is thus extended by the Armagh women through their continuation of active resistance against encroachment on women's rights. This is echoed in the poem on the slide, in which the women write, "Today women have seen the light, and for equality they now fight. No longer is it continually the menial task, for women's liberation has come at last." So through printing, testimonies and these political artistic forms of resistance, the Women Against Imperialism group asserts that print is a form of rebellion. The Women Against Imperialist group are said to have disbanded around 1981 or early 1981 due to, quote, political division and family disputes. And later, some of these women would go on to join Sinn Féin following the dissolution of this Republican feminist group. So thank you for listening to my talk on the Socialist Women's Group, the Belfast Women's Collective, and Women Against Imperialism and their periodicals. I hope you find it interesting, and if you have any comments or questions or would like to discuss any of these periodicals further, you can contact me on my Twitter, which is on the screen, or via my website. Thank you.